So how did people know morality prior to God coming along and giving them commands such as the law of Moses? Well, I submit people innately know what ought not be done. We have here what's called natural law, whereas God hardwires into creation things that ought to be done and things that ought not be done. Hello and welcome. My name's Glenn and I'm here with Steve. We have a ministry we call Reasoning Through the Bible. We reason through verse by verse through the Word of God, and we're in the midst of the book of Genesis, so a little bit of review. We haven't taken a moment to review the flow of the story so far. The book of Genesis is a book of beginnings. That's what the word means. So it is the beginning of the world, but it's also the beginning of the nation or the country of Israel. And most of the book of Genesis deals with four people: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And we're in the midst of Jacob here. We're in Genesis chapter 34. So up to this point in the story, Jacob had tricked his brother and lied to his father to get his brother's blessing. And he tricked his brother Esau into selling his birthright for a bowl of lentil stew. And so Jacob's a bit of a deceiver. That's what his name means. And he learns that what you sow, you will reap, because he has to run away and escape to his uncle Laban's to get away from his brother Esau, who was very angry and had threatened to kill him. So Jacob then learns that other people can deceive too. And Jacob spends 20 years of his life being deceived over and over again by his uncle Laban. He goes on to work for Laban and then decides to leave. He has to sneak off because Laban is such a controlling person. In chapter 32, Jacob wrestles with God to get a blessing. And so that part of it, we see a person in Jacob that wants to be with God, but he also still has an old nature within him. He reminds us of a lot of ourselves. In chapter 33, Jacob reconciles with his brother Esau, and we learned there that worry is often unfounded because Jacob was very worried about Esau. And when he realizes and meets him, then Jacob ends up reconciling and having good relations with Esau. Jacob is still showing favoritism towards his wife Rachel, but not so much to his other wife Leah. And this causes favoritism not only amongst his two wives, but also because favoritism in the children. And it's going to play out, that favoritism plays out in a very negative way throughout the rest of the book. The chapter we're at today, chapter 34, is a very ugly chapter. We have a very ugly scene. Jacob's daughter gets raped, and his sons trick and murder the family that did it, and then loot all their possessions and kidnap their families. So it's a very, very ugly chapter. Let's go ahead and dive in. Steve, if you could read the first two verses of Genesis chapter 34.
Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to visit the daughters of the land. When Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he took her and lay with her by force.
So with this, Dinah, who is the daughter of Jacob, and remember they're back into the land. They'd settled in the land, and one of the leading families of this land, remember Jacob was so much of an itinerant at this point and had been moving around, but they settle in this land, and one of the prominent families there rapes his daughter Dinah. And sexual molestation is a great tragedy and should not be minimized. We've seen too much in our society of sexual molestation. It's a horrible, horrible thing. And our society has gotten saturated with sex, and the molestation has only increased. Even pastors and churches have been guilty of this. And so this brings us to a question, Steve, about our day. How bad is the problem of sexual sins inside the church today?
Any sexual sin and sexual immorality is bad, and inside the church is no better than outside of the church. we shouldn't have any of them. Unfortunately, they do take place, and we've been in some such situations in churches that we've been members of whenever pastors have actually had to step down and have been fired and let go because of sexual immorality. So this is something that is part of our makeup because we are human beings and we're here connected to the world. Satan never rests. He's always out there seeking and roaring like a lion, looking for things to destroy. And churches and people that are in churches and pastors that are in churches, teachers, all gamuts and all life, they're not immune to him going out there trying to cause problems and cause issues and be a enticement to them. In fact, I'd probably say that they're more of a target for Satan.
Sexual sins are especially grievous because it's so personal, and it touches very personally, especially the abusive ones, like this molestation here of this poor woman. And we've seen in our day, Stephen, you I'm sure aware, pastors have fallen to this. Church denominations have been guilty of tolerating it and even covering it up. And I think those are sins that we need to be. Christians of all people should be very aware that this is a possibility of happening and should take steps to prevent it. And when it is discovered, to take appropriate action to get rid of it and to punish the sins when it happens. Of all people, Christians should not be guilty of sexual sins, especially abusive ones. And we should, as a community, come clean and get this out of our midst. How would Christians prevent themselves from falling into sexual sins? How can we, as weak human beings, prevent ourselves from falling into sexual sins?
Recognize what they are, number one. Number two is stay clear of them. Number three, I think, is the more that we are involved in God's word, we're studying his word, and that will change us and change our desires, build up our relationship with God. The closer that we get with him, the more desire we have to please him. And through pleasing him, we therefore want to avoid any type of an activity that is unpleasing to him. And that does include sexual immoral things.
One thing, if I ask myself, how can I keep myself or people around me or the people in my church from falling into sexual sins, is to, one, just treat it very, very seriously. Treat it very, very seriously. You don't play around with dynamite, and you just don't. And because sex is a basic human drive and a basic human desire, then all of us have the potential for committing sins around sex. And so we need to take it very, very seriously and put ourselves into situations where it cannot happen. A lot of churches have things that they do, methods where people are not alone together and things like this. And when especially molestation occurs, we need to be sure and not cover it up. If sexual molestation is a crime, and if church leaders or anyone else for that matter discovers it, then we need to call the police, because it's a crime. And the last thing we need to do is to cover up a sexual sin just because the person has a position of prominence in the church. Ignoring abuse has damaged or destroyed churches, and will continue to do so if we tolerate it. So this poor woman here, Dinah, gets raped in this thing. And it reminds me, Steve, that's not the only time situation like this has happened in the scriptures. 2 Samuel chapter 13, King David had a son named Amnon, and Amnon rapes his sister. And David got angry about it, but he didn't do anything about it. And so that's a crime on David. It's one thing when somebody else commits a crime, and it just adds to the problem when our leaders don't take action and do something about it. And as we're going to see here in this chapter, even Jacob is guilty of some sins here. So ignoring abuse is something we should never, ever do. People, the other part of the crime is people that are victims of these crimes. People who have been abused should be taken seriously. and given professional help. If someone steps up, even if it's a child, and says, hey, something odd has happened here, then we need to take that very seriously and turn it over to the professionals that know how to deal with this. Counseling and responding to molestation and abuse takes sensitivity, it takes professionalism, and should be handled by spiritually mature people. And I just find this to be a great, tremendous sin that we do not need to tolerate, and it needs to be cut away and cut out of our churches and out of our lives. Churches in advance, and I'd give this bit of advice to every church leader out there. Churches should in advance have procedures in place before abuse happens, so that they know how to react if and when it occurs. Don't wait until some problem situation arises and then wonder, oh my goodness, what should I do? No. Think it through in advance, have written procedures in place. If this type of situation arises, what has to happen? And then it becomes just a matter of following the written procedure. And you can come up with the correct procedures when you're thinking clearly, and not when someone close to you has fallen into some kind of a sin. So with that, we'll move on. Steve, if you could start at verse 3 and read down through verse 12, we find out how the family reacts to this tremendous sin.
He was deeply attracted to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the girl and spoke tenderly to her. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Get me this young girl for a wife." Now Jacob heard that he had defiled Dinah his daughter, but his sons were with his livestock in the field, so Jacob kept silent until they came in. Then Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him. Now the sons of Jacob came in from the field when they heard it, and the men were grieved, and they were very angry because he had done a disgraceful thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, for such a thing ought not to be done. But Hamor spoke with them, saying, "The soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him in marriage. Intermarry with us, give your daughters to us, and take our daughters for yourselves. Thus you shall live with us, and the land shall be open before you. Live and trade in it, and acquire property in it." Shechem also said to her father and to her brothers, "If I find favor in your sight, then I will give whatever you say to me. Ask me ever so much bridal payment and gift, and I will give according as you say to me, but give me the girl in marriage."
So again, Dinah, Jacob's daughter, was raped by this man Shechem, and Shechem was following his flesh and not controlling himself. That's the first sin here, and which had caused the molestation. He says he is attracted to Dinah and wants to marry her. Well, it was probably lust and not love, simply because if he had really loved her, then he wouldn't have wanted to abuse her. Lust is abusive. Love is tender and kind. And so if he had really loved her, he wouldn't have abused her. David's son Amnon claimed to love the girl until he raped her, and then he despised her and cut her off and wouldn't have anything to do with her. So oftentimes, people will convince themselves of things just because of fleshly desires, but then they find out later that this is not what was really driving it. It's really just pure lust. So he claims to love her, but I don't believe it. This man Shechem, again, was a wealthy son of this landowner. He was probably spoiled, and he was accustomed to his father buying him what he wanted. So he goes to his father and says, "Give me this girl." He wanted Dinah and asked his father to get her, and then offers to pay whatever price Jacob wanted. So Steve, what's your thoughts on this? What would cause a son to act like this?
I think what you said there, lust will drive people to do these type of things. I find it interesting here that they're talking amongst themselves, and we don't see Dinah having any type of decision in it. And he's also talking to Jacob's sons. We saw, though, that Laban negotiated with the servant whenever he was there on behalf of Abraham getting a wife for Isaac. So we see some of the customs that take place here. that now all of a sudden it's turned into the situation of, well, now we want to go through proper channels. Now we want to provide a dowry and a bride price to you. Now this is how we want to proceed through it after the damage has already been done. So how somebody can think that it's going to be a successful marriage after that happens is a little bit concerning and a little bit miffed as to why that is. On the other side of the coin, at this time, Jacob, they're nomads and they have their livestock and they're going through the land. One of the desires of the nomads were to become part of these city-states that made up the Canaan. So here's a pretty attractive offer to them of, well, intermarry with us and you'll become a member of this city-state. Lot is an example. He became a member of the city-state of Sodom. And so that's an attractive offer to them to be able to trade with them, be able to buy property in the land and settle down in this area. But it just doesn't seem like it's going to be something that's going to be set up to be a successful marriage based on the way that it's starting out.
This man Shechem has molested this girl, he raped her, and then he goes and tries to, okay, well, now I want to marry her, I'll buy my way out of this problem. So if I ask, how can parents raise a person like this? How can parents raise a Shechem? Well, mom, dad, you want to raise a child like this? One of the things you do is give your child whatever they want. Give your child anything they ask for, and you'll raise a Shechem. Or if you don't teach them love and respect for others, don't teach them that they have to be polite and cordial and follow societal rules. If you don't teach them that, then you can raise a Shechem. Another way to raise a child like this is to not teach them that they have to work hard for what they get, that they have to make self-sacrifices and they have to work to achieve some kind of reward. If you just, every time they get into a problem, you buy their way out of it, then you're going to be raising a Shechem. They can't just expect mom and dad to solve every problem for them. Eventually, they need to be able to be taught when they're children, you're not going to get everything you want. And sometimes you're going to get into problems, and I can give you advice, but you're going to have to get your way out of it. I'm not going to fix it for you. You have to suffer the consequences, because that's the way it is with the Lord God. Is we may get away with some things here on earth, but we're not going to get away with it with God. And so the reason this man Shechem acts like this is because of exactly what happened in this passage we read. Daddy comes along and buys his way out of the problem. And we're going to find that this problem, they're not going to be able to buy their way out of. The father, in verse 9, offers Jacob to start intermarrying with them. Steve, what were the biblical commands about intermarrying with people outside of Israel?
They were not to intermarry with the people of Canaan. That's why Abraham sent his servant out to Padam Aram to the relatives, and also why Rebekah convinced Isaac to go ahead and send Jacob out to Padam Aram to amongst the relatives outside of the land of Canaan. They were not supposed to intermarry with the Canaanites.
In verse 7, it talks about this act that happened, this molestation. It says it is a disgraceful thing that ought not be done. A disgraceful thing that ought not be done. Now, at this point in biblical history, the law of Moses that lays out all these many hundreds of commands on how to live had not been given. Law of Moses isn't until many centuries later. So how did people know morality prior to God coming along and giving them commands such as the law of Moses? Well, I submit people innately know what ought not be done. We have here what's called natural law, whereas God hardwires into creation things that ought to be done and things that ought not be done. God works into people's hearts so that we have a conscience, even into all creation, this idea of things that ought to be and ought not to be. So, Steve, do you see that here? Do you see a sort of an innate sense of morality that they should have known? They didn't have God commanding them not to molest this girl. but they should have known. It is a law that ought not be done. So do people know even today that there's a right and a wrong, and God expects some things of us, even though they may not have seen biblical commands on the subject?
Paul talks about this natural law over in Romans, and as his part of his comparison, that whenever the Gentiles were doing things based on the natural law that was given, or that was prior to the law of Moses being given, then this is what I think Paul was bringing out. There is a innate thing within people of knowing what certain things are right and certain things that are wrong. And I do think that that is something that God has given to. Another way that Paul talks about it is that we can see God through creation, and therefore, and he makes his case there in Romans chapter 1, nobody is without excuse of knowing who God is and that there is a God.
One of those passages I think you were alluding to, Steve, is in Romans chapter 2, where God through Paul is explaining that all of us have an innate sense of morality, and we cannot stand before God and say, I didn't know. In the passage there, Romans chapter 2 says this: for when Gentiles who do not have the law, so again, these are people that never heard God's commands. When Gentiles who do not have the law do instinctively the things of the law, these, not having the law, are a law to themselves, in that they show the work of the law written in their hearts. That's Romans 2, verse 14 and 15. So what he's saying there is that we all know, as the sons of Jacob said, these things ought not be done. There's things that we all know ought not be done. Even atheists and materialists that have never read the Bible, don't believe the Bible, they know some things ought not be done. And how did they get this sense of ought and ought not? If God doesn't exist, and that all that does exist is physics and chemistry, matter and motion, then how did we get a sense of moral ought? It's not just survival, because we would claim that survival ought to happen and morality ought to happen. And so we can't just claim it's evolution and physics here. It's something more than that. And it's written on people's hearts, as God says.
I just want to expand on what you said there, Glenn, because sometimes in our sessions, you'll use that term. If it's just physics and chemicals, how do we explain things? And what I want to expand on is that what you actually mean by that is by chemicals is just chemical reactions. So if it's just a chemical reaction, how do you get a conscience out of that?
The way I like to explain it is if I go into my kitchen and I mix together vinegar and baking soda, I'll get a reaction. I'll get molecules in motion. But what I won't get is a moral good or a moral evil. It's just a reaction. So where along the line do we get a moral good and a moral evil? Well, the atheist likes to say it's from survival, and we make a transfer between surviving and moral good. Well, that doesn't work, simply because why is it good to survive? And so they still sneak morality in the side door and call it something else. It's a real problem that is unanswerable unless there's a God in the universe whose nature is good, in which case these sons here of Jacob in Genesis 34 can say these things ought not be done, even though there had never been a command that not do them. That's how. The other thing I see in here, Steve, in this chapter, Jacob's daughter has been raped, and the brothers are naturally incensed. What is Jacob doing? He at this point he's doing nothing, and his daughter has been molested, and he's doing nothing. Remember, he's been playing favorites with his children and favorites with his wives, and Dinah was the daughter of the lesser wife, Leah, and it's only Leah's sons that get angry, and not Jacob and not Joseph. And so we have here this favoritism that was born out of the multiple wives that's now causing people to not take seriously a sexual molestation. And so this is the bitter fruit of polygamy. And it's the bitter fruit of what happens. Jacob, of anybody, should be taking the lead here and deciding what to do. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, he's not doing anything. I think he's thinking beyond just the act itself. And, you could make an argument that cooler heads should prevail. But at the same time, this is an injustice that's been done to a family member. And there's got to be something as far as a punishment associated with what has been done versus just a simple, plain negotiation of no punishment at all.
Now, the passage we just read a minute ago, this man Hamor comes up and says, my son Shechem wants to marry your daughter, and I'll name your price. I'll give you the bride, whatever bride price you want. You can intermarry with us. We can trade together. We can both make a profit here, and just name your price. And so I would think there that this is a temptation for Jacob. It's a temptation to view this as a way to make money. And too many marriages in the past have been viewed as a way to benefit trade and a way to benefit business. Marriage should not be primarily to benefit business. That's not why we join families. Christians need to be wise and not allow people to take advantage of us, because this man Hamor, what we find later in the chapter, and we'll read this, Hamor had come up and said, okay, we want to marry because we like you. But really, when he goes off privately to his townspeople, he's just thinking he's going to take Jacob as a sucker and make money off of Jacob. So Hamor is the one who's got ulterior motives here. He's just viewing this as a way to make money and solve problems here. So let's go ahead and read the next section. Starting in verse 13, we'll find out how Jacob's family reacts to this. But Jacob's sons answered Shechem and his father Hamor with deceit, because he had defiled Dinah, their sister. They said to them, we cannot do this thing to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a disgrace to us. Only in this condition will we consent to you. If you will become like us, in that every male of you be circumcised, then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters for ourselves, and we will live with you and become one people. But if you will not listen to us to be circumcised, then we will take our daughter and go. Now their words seemed reasonable to Hamor and Shechem, Hamor's son. The young man did not delay to do the thing, because he was delighted with Jacob's daughter. Now he was more respected than all the household of his father. So Hamor and his son Shechem came to the gate of their city and spoke to the other men of their city, saying, these men are friendly with us. Therefore let them live in the land and trade in it. For behold, the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters in marriage and give our daughters to them. Only on this condition will the men consent to us to live with us, to become one people, that every male among us be circumcised as they are circumcised. Will not their livestock and their property and all their animals be ours? Only let us consent to them, and they will live with us. So with this, Steve, what do you think Hamor's motivation is for this?
Hamor's motivation is he's seeing how much livestock and the riches that Jacob has is one of the things. Remember when Jacob was trying to appease Esau, when he was coming back to meet Esau, he gave Esau 580 head of livestock, sheep, cattle, other things. Jacob is very wealthy in regards to what he has in the way of livestock. So Hamor sees this of a way of being able to bring some riches to their city. And when he goes to the elders of the city, the officials, that's basically the argument that he makes with them. We can intermarry with them and we'll get the benefit of their livestock and the riches that they have. We'll let them be able to buy property and some other things. But really, he's looking at it as strictly a good move from a way to promote the city or prosper the city.
So in the beginning of the chapter, Shechem, this rich young man from the land, rapes Jacob's daughter Dinah. And then the father, Hamor, comes to Jacob and says, hey, let's get married, name your price. Well, in verse 13, who answers Hamor? Who is the one that actually answers Hamor?
Well, the sons answer Hamor.
I find it interesting that Jacob didn't answer at all. They had come to Jacob as the patriarch, and the sons answer. Jacob didn't do anything here to defend his daughter. And in verse 13, what was the response of the sons? What did they propose?
Jacob's sons, you can see that they have a plot. They have something else in mind, because they answer both Shechem and Hamor with deceit to entertain this offer that's coming from both Shechem and Hamor.
So I find this interesting because their motivation was to try to do justice to this great crime that had been done to their sister. So is it proper for us to try to correct some evil by doing another evil? Is it proper for us to correct a sin by committing another sin?
It is not proper. We've mentioned this in other sessions. It should not be something that we set out to do. It's just going to cause problems later on in other ways if we operate with those type of principles.
We also see here, as we mentioned before, Hamor agrees to this because he goes back to his townspeople and says, hey, look how much money they got. We can get rich off of these guys. So he has this ulterior motive, but he had come across to Jacob, oh, we just want to be nice to you, let's intermarry together. Do people sometimes act friendly towards us just to get our money? Do people sometimes come up and present themselves as one way, but really all they're trying to do is get our money?
Yes, that's why we need to be careful on our business negotiations to understand what's going on. And if you're negotiating trying to take advantage of the other person, guess what? The other person is probably trying to take advantage of you. This is a little bit of a throwback too to Laban and Jacob. They both operated and were deceitful with each other and trying to outdo each other, especially whenever Jacob was trying to build his livestock up so that he could leave and go back to the land. Here are two groups of people. They're both really negotiating and deceitfully with each other.
They are being deceitful, and I find this still to be true today after all these centuries. There are people that come up to us as Christians because we're gullible and we trust people, and all they're really trying to do is to cheat us out of our money. And some of these people present themselves as Christians and they couch themselves with spiritual language when really it's a con job to get our money. So we need to be very careful and give our money to wise places. Now, last thing, Steve, before we leave here for today, at the end of verse 19, it calls Shechem, the son. It says he was more respected than all the household of his father. So I find it interesting that the rapist, the molester, was the most respected person in the family. And so we see here, Steve, this very ugly scene. And at this point, we've got Jacob's sons who's deceiving themselves, being deceivers themselves. And they've made this proposal: if all your men get circumcised, then we'll marry with you. And Hamor looks like they're going to agree. So next time we'll find out what happens.
We're leaving again with another cliffhanger, kind of getting back to these cliffhangers whenever we stop with a session.
Well, one thing we're going to see is that, again, sin is not the way to correct other sin. And we'll find that out next time as we continue to reason through the book of Genesis.
Thank you so much for watching and listening. May God bless you.